Hello, everyone. Welcome to JetBrains Connect, topics and talk from across the landscape of technology. Today on JetBrains Connect, open source, wildly popular, hugely influential, used everywhere. Is it sustainable? I'm your host, Paul Everitt. Today we have Rachel Appel, JetBrains developer advocate for all things .NET. Our other guest today is Stannard, CEO of Petabridge, well known in .NET circles for Akka.NET, which I believe we'll be discussing quite a bit of today. Rachel and Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Paul.
We have several things to go over, not the least of which is introductions. So Aaron, guests go first on JetBrains Connect. You're in Houston now, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm originally from Southern California, grew up in San Diego, and then I went to Los Angeles to work for Microsoft as a developer evangelist on their BizSpark program for a couple of years, back when I was in my early 20s. And so I launched a couple of venture-backed companies one venture-backed company in LA, and then I launched Petabridge after that business failed. Petabridge is not venture-backed. We're a self-funded open source business. We've been up and running since about January 2015. We've got 4 full-time people on staff. And our business is primarily supporting the sort of Akka.NET open source project with training, support, consulting, and a couple of APM tools. And the big new thing we just launched that kind of ties into what this episode is about is a platform called SDK Bin, which is kind of meant to be like NuGet meets the App Store. It's a platform to allow developers to sell proprietary sort of annual licenses. Use it without necessarily having to directly fulfill and manage the sort of sales process manually. It's all meant to be fairly automated.
You have a really unique experience on this, I guess an ongoing experience. So it's really the focus of this episode. Rachel, my first intro to you was, of all things, carpool karaoke with Martin. You've had a varied career. I won't say a singing career, a varied career. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, it's been everything but singing. I started out way back in the day before we had the internet and, there was no Google-driven development. There was no internet. And we did COBOL on a mainframe and stuff like that. So did a bunch of non-Microsoft stuff. And then eventually I was like, oh, cash cow over here with Microsoft development and jumped in with VB3. And then kept going, right, all the way up till now. Mostly stayed with Microsoft for the rest of the time after that. I also worked at Microsoft as a developer evangelist as well, but on the opposite coast. I was out of the New York office. Awesome place to be. So if I wasn't working at Microsoft, usually I was consulting on my own. So just going out there as an independent consultant and doing that thing. I did 2 stints at Microsoft, the DE, and then later on the content team for Docs.
How many trillions of people probably say I jumped in with VB?
Yeah, seriously.
The gateway drug to programming, I guess, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I was programming before that, but that was basically what got me in, like, firmly planted in Microsoft. Yeah. Before that, I did some Borland. I even did Clipper for a while. That is just awful. So I did stuff like DBase, a lot of DBase, right, back when that was a thing.
Open source sustainability is an urgent topic. It's one of those urgent topics that not enough people are talking about, but it really is sitting below the surface as being urgent. First, though, let's get the audience caught up on the issue. Rachel, what is open source for the purposes of this kind of more businessy conversation?
Yeah, so it's about a few things. And one of it is software that is developed in the public eye collaboratively. So generally you have volunteer maintainers on projects. It could be anywhere from a single person up to hundreds or thousands of people. And licensing is a big deal for it. So the licensing generally needs to allow for anybody to use it, modify it, distribute it for any purpose. So that means personal projects or commercial projects even, so they can use it. And it's usually free. And I'm going to say usually free because we're going to kind of get into a lot of that. The thing is that most of them don't charge a fee for the product, but you might see a few out there where they have a free version and a paid for version as well, almost like an app store kind of thing. Most of them, though, kind of go with the free thing. So that's it. Like, those are the kind of the main points, and it's everywhere. I remember for a while, certain types of industry, like government and other ones, mandated an SLA and then said we can't use open source. But forget that now. Everybody's using it now. So it's pervasive as well.
Aaron, got anything you want to add to that on kind of a primer of open source?
I would argue, like playing off what Rachel just said, the history of open source software is not linear in terms of, sort of the way the industry adopted it and how it's been used by consumers. All software was originally open source going back to, let's say, the 1950s and 60s. And that's because the primary impediment to being able to run software was actually getting access to a computer somewhere. And so all software originally started open source. And that really began to change in the 1970s when Apple, I think, won a case in the Supreme Court that made source code copyrightable. On top of that, as computing became cheaper, software became more valuable. And that's where the emergence of kind of the software industry really started. That's why companies like Atari and Microsoft all kind of got rolling around then, purely software-focused companies. And then as a result of that, in the 1980s, you had this big kind of proprietary software boom. And then open source was kind of dormant for a long time, up until really, I would say, the early 1990s, when the Linux project kicked off, and a number of other technologies that we kind of depend on today. A good example would be the JVM. You started being introduced around that time. The Erlang programming language and runtime started getting open sourced around that stretch of time. Other projects that are kind of viewed as pretty fundamental to the development of dynamic websites like PHP and MySQL also started getting open sourced. And then that kind of started a trend that we're seeing the apotheosis of right now, which is that open source is eating the world. It's everywhere. Even, let's say, the Pentagon uses open source inside a number of their different systems. And I would assume even some safety critical systems probably take advantage of a handful of open source libraries, like maybe, Boost or something like that, being developed in the C++ ecosystem. So open source is now pervasive everywhere. And largely what kind of controls the ebb and flow, whether or not people use open source, is it's all about aligning with people's self-interest. If I'm a software developer and I work for a large company, it's very easy for me to adopt something that I don't need to pay for, because that allows me to do an end run around the entire procurement bureaucracy that sits between me and a single dollar that my company controls. So that's a kind of a gateway drug if you're trying to build an open source business, is having this sort of free layer of componentry that developers can readily access without having to talk to the dreaded procurement department. Now we've kind of reached a stage where so much open source is being used so heavily, and there's so few dollars being sent back to the people who actually produce it, that we kind of have the equivalent of like a little trade deficit going on right now, where these producers, who are oftentimes like individual developers working on projects in their spare time, are being asked by Fortune 500 companies to fix bugs with like a 1 business day turnaround for free. And it's kind of absurd if you think about it. But that's sort of the state of the industry as it stands right now.
Hey, let me bring zero in on that part. And it's funny you say open source is eating the world, while you also argue that it's starving to death.
Yep, a bit of a paradox, right?
Yeah. Let me get a little bit about open source history and into your open source history story from a sustainability and business perspective. In a previous life, I learned about open source. It costs a lot of money to give stuff away for free. So before getting into the sustainability crisis, over the years, how has open source in business, particularly small and very, very small businesses, worked, especially for you?
So the open source business, so a little bit of history of Petabridge. So Akka.net was a project that I co-founded along with some other developers when I was working on my venture-backed startup. So Akka.net was never meant to be a source of income for me or for anyone who worked for me. It was a means to an end. We needed the ability to do highly concurrent stream processing to build this marketing automation platform we were developing. The Actor model happened to be a great fit for that. We were an all .NET shop, and there were 0 technologies available on the .NET platform. This is like 2013. Late 2013, early 2014, there was 0 technologies available for us to accomplish anything like that. And so we took a look at the next best thing, which is what the Java ecosystem had produced. And so there's the original Akka project, which is all written in Scala. And that was a really good fit for what we wanted to do. And we decided that the lesser of two evils, putting a Java application into a super high traffic system when none of us have any experience performance profiling it or managing it was option A. Option B was porting this framework and this programming methodology none of us understood very well, but running it inside a technology stack that between my engineering team at the time, we probably had 4 decades of experience figuring out how to manage that under large workloads. So we decided that was the lesser of two evils. That business, through no fault of Akka's, the market that we were serving just was bad, and that business died. And as soon as within a week of me publishing we're shutting down blog post, I had people hitting me up on LinkedIn for consulting requests. So Akka.net as a basis for Petabridge's business was very much accidental. And that is typically how I think a lot of sort of open source software starts. There's a handful of companies you can look at where some industry veterans who had worked on something like databases before, or maybe they had worked on building CDNs, see a need for a recurring need for let's say a piece of infrastructure. And they figure, we can go ahead and build an open source project and launch a business concurrently. That does happen in some cases, but I think that's probably the exception.
Was there any phase in there where you kind of did the business plans for dummies, where you get the vision and the mission statement, but most importantly, you start thinking exit plan? Did you ever do anything like that?
Absolutely. Right now, the way our business is kind of implemented, since it's still very, very much built around like my personal expertise and the expertise of my team, that's not an asset you can easily sell.
Not much of a multiple there.
Yeah, exactly. Not much of a multiple there. You're very limited in terms of how quickly you can scale, because the amount of time it takes to build a competency around a technology that handles something as complex as like large scale concurrent programming, which is what Akka.net does. It takes a long time to build that competency, and you can't grow the business very fast. It's kind of like breeding elephants instead of breeding rabbits,
That's
not
very visual way to put it.
Yep, just takes a much longer time per animal. So that's why we're kind of putting a lot of focus right now on APM tools and support plans. Those types of, let's say, renewable sources of revenue are inherently easy. It's easier to model sort of what your future revenue is going to be that way. You can go ahead and compute attrition rates and that type of thing a lot more easily. And that growth tends to compound over time. And it's easier to go ahead and build a sort of saleable business around that. So we're definitely very much focused on that right now, largely because I've got a lot more. I'll kind of work my way back to the mission statement, because that is actually what we really began with, was a mission statement and a vision for what we wanted to accomplish with our open source business. But I want to go ahead and ultimately have a much more, let's say, scalable source of income than what we do right now, doing consulting projects and on-site trainings, although can't really do that with a pandemic. But those types of business, well, that type of project-oriented work is lucrative and it pays the bills. It's ultimately not all that repeatable. It's kind of like hunting versus farming.
The core issue of, is open source still sustainable? I feel like something has changed in the last 5 to 10 years, and what used to work for open source businesses no longer does. Aaron, what's your view? Where are we now on open source sustainability?
Well, my view is that most open source projects aren't run like businesses, which is why they're not sustainable. There's essentially a lack of alignment between the value that users get and the value that the contributors get. And that's the crux of a sustainability problem, is that misalignment of incentives. So I'll give you an example. Akka.net, we certainly still have some things to improve upon from a sustainability point of view. Probably the biggest one I would say is that we always need to be thinking about increasing our truck factor. That's probably the best measure of sustainability in a project. And to explain what that metric means, it's the number of people who need to be hit by a truck in order for this project to die, basically. So, and the truck factor, by the way, is astonishingly low, even for really big open source projects. Like in one of the presentations I gave on this back in July, the truck factor of Docker was around 15 people at its peak. So 15 people getting hit by a truck would certainly be a bad stroke of luck, but we should never underestimate 2020's ability to deliver there. So that's a pretty high truck factor, but for a project that's as pivotal to, let's say, global infrastructure as Docker, that's still pretty low. In the neighborhood, somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 or 90% of most really popular open source projects, meaning more than, let's say, a few thousand stars on GitHub, have a truck factor of 1 or 2.
It's interesting, as an anecdote, in 1994, the Python project had its very first get-together with including the language creator, Guido van Rossum. And on the agenda was, what if Guido gets hit by a bus? And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that he stepped down as benevolent dictator for life. Rachel, do you have some comments on this particular point, which I think is extremely insightful? Aaron's point about misalignment.
Yeah, well, first I want to say, why is it always that developers keep getting hit by buses? This is such a thing, right? It's our measurement for everything.
We're just not very coordinated,
I guess. But aside from that, yes, it does seem that that's an issue. And I'm not sure, Aaron, if you believe that most projects can go and be sustainable if they had alignment or not. I think there's some interesting gray areas here. I do see that as an issue. What I see happening is a lot of people, you have these broad categories of, we've built this cool thing we needed, kind of tossed it out over the wall. And then sometimes it becomes popular and they go, oh, geez, wow, what just happened there? Now everybody wants us to do stuff. And then they kind of get sucked into it. And I think I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and it was a front-end conference, and the creator of the Vue framework gave a talk about it. And he talked about this in burnout, and he goes, well, I never thought this would happen. And it did. And then I couldn't field all the requests. And he didn't even think about a business model or anything right off the bat, or for some time later. So you had this kind of issue that Aaron's talking about. Also, I think developers kind of enjoy geeking out much more than running a business, by and large, right? I mean, you have some of us who have MBAs or whatever, or do the business side of things, but I think a lot of people are thinking tech more so than, well, how am I going to sustain it? I think most people have other goals than trying to sustain it. And I think sustainability is one of the big issues in open source right now.
That's kind of the misalignment, right? They've got goals that don't match sustainability.
Right. Not even that don't match. You just don't, it's not even on the playing field. They don't even think of it as something to align to. It's not like they even realize, oh, that's a thing and I kind of don't care about it, which would at least be on the radar at that point, but it's kind of not for most people. A lot of them too, you do have this issue of, I was just poking around to see what people were saying about open source for this. And, of course I go to Wikipedia, the ultimate, truthful resource for everything, right? And it did mention, sponsors and company-backed stuff. And it said one of the things is that companies save $60 billion by using open source. Now, how much do you think those contributors and maintainers get? They're not getting $60 billion. And
if you count in the cost of therapy, it's a negative $60 billion.
It's negative, right? So that's another issue there too. I mean, so the other issue, you can't just be like, well, you have to pay for the software. I think Aaron has some great information here about the fact that once you could find that alignment, you don't necessarily have to charge for the software, but there are these auxiliary practices that you could do that are closer to farming than hunting, and maybe a little bit of both, that that you can build something sustainable. But some projects, even, I think, maybe just don't lend themselves to that at all. There's always going to be a couple outliers, no matter what. So
I have a couple of discussion points I'd like to go over based on reading and watching, Aaron, your stuff over the years. First one's kind of personal, if you don't mind. Looking at your sustainability talk, looking at the Aaron Hammer talk at Cascadia JS about his open source project. Listen to Brett Cannon, a wonderful person in the world of Python, give a PyCon keynote, and my personal experience with Chris McDonough, creator of packages that are critically important to major businesses. The intensity is shocking. The intensity of the feeling of burnout, the feeling of obligation and guilt, the inability to make it all add up. Aaron, are you seeing a lot of that out there?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of my personal experience, I've been the lead maintainer of Akka.net for 7 years. Since about, I'd say around like November, December 2013, somewhere in there. And so I've been at this a long time. I personally haven't had issues with burnout because, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this back to the other open source maintainers in a second, but I haven't had burnout because I kind of look at the time I invest into making Akka.net better and better all the time. And that includes doing things like spending 40 hours tracking down a bug that ended up being a one-line code fix, but it caused some really severe problems with people who are running large Akka.net clusters, that type of thing. That's worth it to me because continually making that investment is essentially like aligns to my bottom line. If Akka.net continues to have a good reputation for being well-maintained, high-quality code base, maintains semantic versioning really well, has good documentation, that attracts people who could ultimately be my customers. And so I view it as, I have an opportunity to go ahead and do this. And I also enjoy the technical work too. That's an important aspect of it. There's still new problems that I run into all the time with Akka.net, things I like to model. And so I don't really have creative burnout there. Plus, this is also kind of building an organization, which is a whole nother level of challenge beyond just maintaining a project by yourself, right? So I've not had any real issues with it because I feel like my sort of interests are aligned with our users in that respect. There's a bunch of cases, like I was remembering Mark Gravel on Twitter last week, one of the developers at Stack Exchange that's built a lot of their really popular open source technologies, talking about all the trouble he has balancing his demands working for Stack Exchange and maintaining, 3 or 4 pretty popular open source projects. I feel for someone like Mark because they're between a rock and a hard place. You become a victim of your own success once a project gets pretty well established and you start having a lot of users, because that's when all the weird edge cases that are expensive to address start coming in. You also start getting a bunch of pull requests that don't have, let's say, a whole lot of let's say, clarity on what problem they're trying to solve. It doesn't necessarily align to what your goals are at the project. And you basically have to get into the habit of telling people no a lot, which really gets grating if you don't have, let's say, a very strict, well-defined sort of set of publicly stated roadmap goals and that type of thing. So it gets political too, which I think also wears down developers. To Rachel's point, a lot of people who start open source programs, just want to sling code. They don't want to turn into a program manager, or turn into an evangelist, or turn into a marketer, or an HR department, and all these other things you end up having to do when you become a maintainer of a popular open source project. So there's it exerts a lot of pressure on the handful of people who are making a lot of decisions on those projects.
And that handful, a lot of them are doing it on their side time, not as part of their regular job. Yeah, Aaron, I've got a point for you about sustainability from your talks. This is kind of we've been talking a little bit about have a little sympathy for these hard, underappreciated workers. Let's go to the other side of the fence. You talked about the billions or both of you talked about the billions that are being saved, not spent because of free and open source. I believe you talk about the unexposed risk that corporations are facing because they are utterly dependent on these projects that are hanging on by a thread.
So this is the why should an open source consumer care about sustainability portion. One of the things I often talk about in terms of trying to give people a 40,000 foot view of the open source ecosystem is supplier diversity is something that works in your favor. You want to always have multiple options for tools to solve problems you run into. You don't want there to be some monolithic central dependency that is so critical that if it disappears, the market suddenly has a vacuum, right? And so that's one of the things you want to be mindful of as a member of any software ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Well, what lack of sustainability ultimately does is it chips away at, let's say, the supplier diversity, where it's going to start thinning out the number of players who are maintaining and updating open source technologies you can use. But the bigger problem, and we're actually dealing with this right now in the Akka.NET project, because one of our critical dependencies was a library that Microsoft made called .NETty, which was a port of the Netty sort of reactive socket library from Java to C#, and was originally used inside some of Azure IoT's products as well, like the IoT application gateway, things like that. It's my understanding that team actually switched over to using Rust for everything. And so without telling anybody, and by the way, there were a ton of contributors, including me, who worked on .NETty, and that project's just stale and it's abandoned. There's a bunch of performance issues with it, a bunch of security fixes and other things that other third-party users have found who've been depending on it. And it's just crickets out of Microsoft there. So one of the things I bring up in my talk is that where truck factor comes into play for individual, let's say, consumers open source, is if the priorities shift. Let's say the priorities were aligned for .NETty between Microsoft, the producers, and all the consumers of it originally, being used in a Microsoft product, being used in their code samples, being developed by the team that built the Azure product. Well, when their priorities shifted to say, hey, why don't we go ahead and rewrite this in Rust? That'll be a lot more efficient for all the embedded devices that need to use these clients to do X, Y, Z. When that change happened, all of a sudden, the users of that open source, which includes Akka.NET and all of our downstream users, we were suddenly not aligned with Microsoft there anymore. And as a result, as a consequence of that, the project was abandoned. So that lack of incentives there, and by the way, so I guess one of the things I'm alluding to is that the incentives of the maintainers can change. And so there's certain risk levels based on the different, let's say, business models that those open source projects use. And so I mentioned in that PowerPoint, I think, that .NETty was what began as what I call an auxiliary technology, where that technology was actually part of another product and not a product in and of itself. Therefore, it was kind of like a piece of componentry that was open sourced. Well, when they replaced that component, it was basically became a piece of abandonware. And that happens pretty frequently. If .NETty were, on the other hand, let's say a piece of core business for Microsoft, I can't imagine what sort of business model they would have for it, but let's just play devil's advocate here for a second. And let's say they were making money directly off of people buying .NETty as a service hosted on Azure somewhere. They were making, let's say, they were able to go ahead and get all sorts of licensing deals because of some proprietary version of .NETty they were selling to some of their device manufacturing partners or whatever. That project would have much more sort of strengthened alignment with all the downstream consumers than it ended up having. I kind of rated the different business models and how vulnerable they are to abandonment. One of the
you make an interesting point about downstream. I want to get Rachel's comment on this, but unless your name is Linus, everybody's downstream of somebody, right?
Absolutely.
And I've got this mental image about some big old corporation who's downstream of like all these open source projects. And it's like an armada of trucks driving at your intellectual property that you don't even know is out there. Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about the corporate side of open source sustainability before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple facets to it. One is, yes, the island of misfit open source projects, right? So it's just where they all go to die.
It's a big island.
that happens. Now, if you're a company like Ford, cars, or GM, or, some big company, okay, sure, you have money, you can just take a fork and run with that, or if you have the licensing to do that, or you can rewrite it yourself or buy a commercial product or something, right? Oops, it happened. But if you're a small company relying on this, that could really dig in, right? That could be very painful for you and cause a lot of issues depending on how important that was. So yeah, all those downstreamers could be anything from the tiny fish all the way up to the big whales in the ecosystem. So that's something. Also, it seems like for whatever reason, developers, once a project gets abandoned, nobody does seem to want to be like, hey, actually that code was pretty good. Let's pick it up and continue it here. Maybe fork it over. And I wanted a little different direction when I was using this. How about I do that now? Oh, no, nobody wants to do that, right?
Green fields forever.
Yeah. So you have that as kind of a weird cultural issue amongst software developers. But yeah, so this happens where you could have some of these ripple effects. Also on the big corporate side is you do have now the companies going, oh crap, yeah, this happens. And I think it's happened enough to large companies that we now have .NET Foundation from Microsoft, right? So their whole thing. Oh, and they're not Microsoft, but they are backed by Microsoft. There's quite a few Microsoft people on it, but also like JetBrains participates in this and other individuals and companies, and they're out there helping to promote and help maintainers and help get more of those businessy kind of resources like logos and commercial support and stuff like that. I mean, it's enough that the big company said, well, we need to seed one of these third-party foundations to help this ecosystem thrive a little better because it is so unstable and so much ends up in that graveyard. So
Aaron, put a bow on the corporate side and then let's get to the exit.
Sure. On the corporate side of things, here's my recommendation. Open source projects that want to be sustainable have to explicitly choose a business model and stick with it. Donations will probably not save you. The math on them royally sucks.
Missing some zeros.
Missing some zeros. It's like the problem is software developers are too expensive for donations. Unless you're, let's say, a programmer on Twitch with tens of thousands of subscribers, you're probably screwed. And donations will probably not save you. So you got to pick a business model. Not all of them necessarily require people to give you money in exchange for your labor. Starting a business is risky. Always has been. And doing it around open source is no different. So business models you can pick. Maybe you want to go ahead and get a more prestigious job that pays better, or maybe you want to become a freelance, let's say, independent contractor, and you want to land some gigs all around your open source projects. Those are both very low risk ways of trying to extract some value out of this open source you created. No one would fault you for either of those either. In fact, you'd probably be doing the end users a favor by actively committing more to it and doing that in order to attract some followers and some business. So the actual maintainers of the open source need to explicitly choose a way they're going to align those incentives and make them sustainable. On the other side of the table, this is kind of a tricky problem because it requires a culture shift in two different ends of the network. One is on the production side, the other is on the consumption side. If you're a company that depends on open source in some critical areas, here's a couple things I suggest you do. You should be signing up for a support plan if they offer it, or offering to sponsor the project. Even though I just mentioned that, I don't think sponsorship scale. That's partly a function of companies kind of view this as just like free stuff and they're going to use it. If you're dependent on, let's say, a component like identity server in your business, or a component like Alka.net, and this is running, let's say, a piece of software that generates 10, 20, 30, $40 million a year in revenue for you, and you don't want to spend, like an Alka.net developer support plan costs $7,200 a year. You don't want to go ahead and spend that type of money keeping infrastructure alive that helps you generate $40 million. It's like the amount, how small that money is versus the amount of value you get from it are multiple orders of magnitude apart. from an economic and from a risk management standpoint, putting our CEO hat on, it's a no-brainer. We use a library called AppMetrics inside one of our products. It's kind of like a generalized telemetry library that supports a whole bunch of different metric systems for ASP.NET. We just started sponsoring them. I think a relatively small amount of money, maybe, I don't know, like $50 a month. We might go ahead and increase it from there as we keep using it some more. But that's helping us keep a product that we sell for $4,000 a year alive.
Sure.
And so it's like that's the least we could do in that type of thing.
And I like the way you framed it about the replacement cost as well, because that's pretty shocking. Rachel, go ahead. One more point you got to make.
Actually, I have a bit of a question for Aaron. Like, what would your opinion be? Say you're that individual programmer and you just throw something out there and you really, really do not want to do the business thing. And you should if you want it to be successful, but you don't. You just want it to be a small little project. But then one day you start to see, like, all of a sudden it's starting to go viral. Everybody's using it. They love this project. And you're starting to collapse under your own weight, right? You need more maintainers, but you're having that pit of success problem. What can they do? Can they stop the inevitable train? Can you, other than doing the business thing, is there anything that solo person can do?
Unfortunately, you are going to have to take on the burden of management somehow, whether that's being a community organizer and trying to get more volunteers to take on some of the actual technical support and like sort of frontline support burden, or as a business owner and starting a company. There is no escape from that problem without scaling your organization. It doesn't necessarily have to be starting a business. You can partner with a foundation and go down, let's say, the route of trying to attract more volunteer contributors. And that could also include things like, one of the things the .NET Foundation is probably going to do at some point is working with some of the large large .NET users, so big banks, healthcare companies, that type of thing, to help actually start fostering some open source programs. So the engineers who depend on libraries like Identity Server might go ahead and start contributing some more code to it. So that's something that ultimately I think you're going to have to, that's a pill you're going to have to swallow. Either you got to walk away from the project, or you got to pick a business model, or you got to find a way to go ahead and become a bit of a community organizer. But there is no fourth option that I can see out of that mix.
And the Identity Server that Aaron brought up, and the blog post, The Future of Identity Server, is a really candid backstory on making some of those choices. So highly recommended to Google for The Future of Identity Server. This is an important topic, really important topic. It's a hard topic. It needs solving. We just can't keep kicking the can down the road on it. Let's wrap up. Rachel, what's your key takeaway?
Well, it's everywhere. You can't escape open source. And if you're that solo developer, you can't just throw the spaghetti on the wall and see if it sticks. Right? You have to do something. You have to know that these things can happen if it gets popular, and you have to manage your success, which you might not even want, right? You might get thrown into it. I know it's horrible, success and popularity. Nobody wants that. But sometimes you don't, but you do have to deal with it anyway. And yes, we need the companies to step up and stop just simply being like, ooh, free goodies in the bag. So don't just sponsor and buy the licenses, but you know what? You have developers. You can give them 20% projects and put them on these open source packages that you use. And then guess what?
Well, it will help your retention.
It'll help that, and you'll be able to participate in driving where that open source goes as well. Right?
Indeed. Well said.
So it gives you a competitive advantage.
Yeah, well said. Aaron, you're going to hang up with us, and you're going to dive right back into the middle of kind of living this whole story. What's next for you and open source and sustainability?
Well, the biggest thing that we've got going on in sort of the sustainability project right now is SDK Bin, which is our platform for trying to make it less risky for open source projects to become businesses. So a lot of the stuff around building a sales platform, actually delivering product to customers, triaging support issues, handling the onboarding and some of the other, let's say, retention and renewal issues that come up with a recurring revenue business. We're trying to automate as much of that as possible, including really nasty stuff like dealing with international taxes, which is much worse than managing a popular open source project, I promise. But I'm trying to work on that because my hope is I would love to see tens of thousands of new ISVs, independent software vendors, sprout up around open source and start kind of building a culture of a little bit more, we'll go ahead and call equitability with how we consume open source inside the ecosystem, where we go ahead and get a whole bunch of stuff for free that allows us to prototype and try things out with very little risk as consumers of open source. But when we start going into production, we want to go ahead and maintain an eye on like supply chain risk. This is what manufacturers have had to do for decades, right? We want to make sure our supply chain's healthy. And the way you do that with something that's like an open source project is you make sure some of the value you're getting from that open source sees its way back to the producers, either in the form of contributions or in the form of cash. Whichever one of those currencies kind of works better for your organization and for the project. But the current status quo of doing neither is at the core of why we have the sustainability problem.
Yeah, your point about international taxes is interesting related to exit plan, because the primary ideas are M&A, merger and acquisition, or go public. It's never, at least from a Silicon Valley capitalism perspective, it's never discussed that maybe the exit plan is just to be a valid ongoing concern that pleases their customers. And so if the model you're talking about where, international tax is the answer to the question, how much worse could things get?
Taxes and death, yes, are usually the
Yes.
answers to that question.
And date time arithmetic. For me, I started an open source company in, of all things, 1993. We released the first open source application server, did 3 rounds of VC, got a write-up in Cathedral and Bazaar under the heading, "Give away a recipe, open a restaurant." I am firmly committed on this topic. I'm firmly committed to letting the current generation figure it out for themselves. That's it for today's JetBrains Connect. Aaron, thank you very much for being with us, for framing this for us, and for all the work that you're doing.
Paul and Rachel, I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.
Rachel,
Thanks, Paul.
Rachel, pleasure as always. See you Friday for Avocado Happy Hour.
Yes.
Thanks for watching this episode of JetBrains Connect, topics and talk from across the landscape of technology. Want more? We got more. Click subscribe down below or up above, wherever it is. You're going to like the next episode.